Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. This is episode 401. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL wire site that covers the Arizona Cardinals. And as this is a typical recording on a Tuesday show, Seth Cox, my co-host from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, the SB Nation Arizona Cardinals site, and one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, is here to talk Cardinals. Seth, how are things going with everything? New head coach, we know the coordinators. We're starting to get position coaches. We can almost start to talk about the roster, right?
Yeah, it's really getting to a good spot. And I think you and I agree that there weren't a lot of surprises from what we had been hearing. I mean, Jess and I we don't try to break any news, but we do get a lot of information passed along to us. And those were the names we had been hearing, right? Like it was going to be I shouldn't say that. Who Jonathan Gannon wanted, we had heard about. I'm more impressed that they're getting everybody they wanted, right? Like that's not something that we're used to. I mean, it's really been 10 years since this has kind of gone that way. And I want your opinion on it, and something we'll discuss tonight is, do you think that has more to do with Gannon, Austin Fort, or just the absence of maybe somebody that had been there the last decade?
That was a super nice way to refer to Steve Keim. But and honestly, I think, especially when it comes to the coordinator stuff, I think it has to do a lot with Gannon. Period. I think it has to do with Gannon. I think it kind of, like when Bruce Arians came, like he had his guys. And so I think Gannon kind of had his guys already kind of lined up. And yeah, that's in fact, that's what we're going to talk about in this show. Since we last recorded, since Seth and I recorded last week, Gannon had his introductory press conference, and in addition to that, there's some bonus content because he also spoke with Peter King from MD Sports, so he had Football Morning in America. So we get some insights about Jonathan Gannon. We now know the coordinators, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the coordinators, what we think and their experience, comments that Gannon said about the offense, and some other comments that he said, and I'm going to throw this out there. This is I'm not going to normally do this, but I'm going to talk about it. We'll actually in this first segment. But first off, Jonathan Gannon, we know, is the head coach. And now the team has officially, so as of Tuesday afternoon, recording on a Tuesday afternoon, the show will post on Wednesday. And for those who are regular listeners, I've got a treat for you guys posting that we'll publish on Friday. Cardinals offensive lineman Lecitus Smith recorded a nice half-hour episode with me Tuesday afternoon talking about last season and the offseason. You don't want to miss that. You don't want to miss the last episode we just recorded with Devon Kennard on Saturday. Make sure you get a listen to that. Lots of insight about the time with him and the new book that he has coming out in a couple of months. But the coordinators were announced officially. They were reported over the weekend, and we know it is Drew Petzing, offensive coordinator, formerly the quarterback's coach for the Cleveland Browns. We talked about him last episode, last week when you were on the show. Defensive coordinator Nick Rawlis also was completely expected. And then special teams coordinator Jeff Rogers is retained. He comes back again. So interesting thing about Rogers, he was hired with Steve Wilks. He lasted through Cliff Kingsbury and now is lasting into Jonathan Gannon's staff. I want to post this question just to get it out of the way. And it's something that hasn't gotten a lot of traction nationwide, and perhaps the Cardinals historically get some slack, can be cut some slack for this. this is a super white staff, and I don't like to bring this up, but the Cardinals, which have a history of some diversity in there, they had a white general manager, had a white head coach, and now they have a pair of white coordinators. In fact, all the coordinators are white. And while they did fulfill the requirements for the Rooney Rule at every level for who they interviewed for general manager, for head coach, and even for the coordinators, the one thing that we kind of know is that even heading into the coordinator interviews, Gannon knew who we wanted, and they did the due diligence. So I don't know how much of a formality the other interviews were, but Gannon wanted Petzig, and Gannon wanted Rawlis, and he got them. Is there any concern that you have for what might be the discussion about the Cardinals moving forward, is in terms of the ethnic and the racial part of the hirings?
No, because if things are coming out, and obviously none of it is official until the Cardinals announce it. So, you look at even the Petzing and Rowlis that just got announced officially by the team today. Like you said, we're recording February 21st. It was literally today that the team posted, or not posted, but sent out their press release that they've signed these guys to contracts, and it was 2:30 in the afternoon, so 3 hours ago. So it wasn't, so we've known this information, or had this information, since what, the 18th, and it took them 3 days to come, so it's not set in stone yet. But here's what I'll say. It sounds like they're getting Drew Terrell, who was the wide receivers coach in Washington. I'm assuming he's going to have a slightly lateral move, be the receivers coach and
passing game coordinator.
Game coordinator.
That way you get that coordinator name and title, and so that usually means a little bit more money.
Well, and so here, and so this is what I was going to ask you, and this is something we talked about pre-Gannon with Flores and Lou Anarumo as well. Doesn't it kind of feel like it, and it's good and bad, but doesn't it kind of feel like that Gannon is putting his ducks in a row for quick changes, like immediate success, and to lose lose Drew Petzing in 2 or 3 years, and then you have Drew Terrell in-house to be the next guy? Like, it almost seems like that's what he did with this hire, with these hires, is like, Petzing's my guy. I've worked with Petzing for a long time. I think they had 3 years together, overlap in Minnesota or something like that. However, I'm gonna grab this guy, Drew Terrell, who really impressed me in the interviews, who I really like, who has a great reputation among the NFL, 31 years old, another young guy. Look at what he's done in Washington with those wide receivers. My goodness, those guys, you want to talk about, not spending a lot of capital and getting a ton in return. That's what you're doing in Washington. And so you grab him, and then Josina Anderson came out today that they're likely hiring Israel Wolfork as the quarterback coach, and he is actually a guy that's gone through the NFL's diversity program, coaching fellowship program. He was the Bill Walsh fellowship intern, and then he got the Bill Willis diversity coaching internship with the Browns, which is the Browns specific coaching internship. And it sounds like he's going to be the quarterback coach. And so I think maybe, people can say, oh, well, they replaced, African-American and Vance Joseph with, a young 29-year-old white guy and Nick Rallis. But at the end of the day, they've also put a lot of effort into bringing in positional coaches and getting guys in prime positions on the staff to be successful, and young guys. Like I said, Terrell's 31. Wolfork, I think, is the same age. I think they're literally both like 31, 32. And so they're getting, like you said, passing game coordinator, and he's going from being an intern or a fellow to a quarterback coach. And I think that has to do with Petzing, right? Like Petzing probably came in immediately and said, I want this guy. Like, I want this guy on my staff. I don't care what position it is. Like, this is who I want. And, again, it's not done. So Terrell's not done. Wolfwork's not done. But I think they're filling out the staff because this is all we know so far offensively. We don't have any information defensively yet, right?
Correct.
So other than who's gone.
Yes, which seems to be everyone.
Yeah, everybody but Billy Davis, who everybody wants gone, right? Here's what I'll also say about that, just to quell all concerns. I know Nick Rallis is going to be the defensive coordinator, but I don't think you're going to find a better guy to help the linebackers in the NFL than Nick Rallis, outside of maybe D'Amico Ryans. Like,
I mean, just look at the Eagles' linebacker production last year. Just look at their three starters. T.J. Edwards did fantastically playing that middle linebacker because Kaiser White, and then Hassan Reddick. White had 110 tackles, Edwards had 159 tackles, and then Reddick had 16 sacks.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's just it. You look at it, I think there's always a concern when it comes to that. And there's going to be issues with the Austin Fort situation anyways, when you had two African Americans in-house that you bypassed. But I'll say this, if they turn over the front office and scouting staff, then there's really nothing to worry about, because the fact that they've cleaned house offensively, they're pretty close to cleaning house defensively, and they're bringing in all new guys. I think that changes things, right? As opposed to just bringing in a defense coordinator or offense coordinator or things like that.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, let's talk about the Petzing hire in particular, because we talked a little bit about it. He seems to be kind of out. He's coached a ton of different positions, but he seems to be, of all the people out there, he's the one that people seem to know the least about. And he worked with quarterbacks. He worked with running backs. He's basically done everything you could do offensively with different position coaches. And we know that he kind of comes in with sort of a West Coast background. How excited are you for a Petzing hiring?
What I'm excited about with Petzing is, his background. We talked about this briefly last time because, again, it wasn't done. So, we didn't want to completely shoot the whole episode out and then it not work out, right? And then and then you and I have to re-record and I have to explain to everybody again who these guys are. But you just look at where the tree he comes from, and he comes from a Stefanski tree, right? And then you look and you push back, right? And this is where it gets super boring. So if you guys need to take a nap or anything like that, feel free. But you go from you go Stefanski, and then you've got he was under, I believe, Pat Shurmur, right? So Shurmur was under you go back, Shurmur was under Andy Reid, right? And so then you go back and he's under, and so that's kind of how this all works. And so
he's like the great grandchild of Andy Reid in terms of coaching.
Right. And so so he's like the fifth great grandchild of Bill Walsh. And so when you really look at it, realistically, we're talking about a West Coast offense that's, and people, I don't know if people understand West Coast is now, what Kansas City and San Francisco run, where you can be spread West Coast, right? As opposed to just straight up West Coast, where it used to just be all under center, zone blocking, boots, waggles, all of that good stuff. Now you have a litany of different things, but it's going to be a lot of pre-motion. I would guess that they're going to be closer to 60-40 shotgun to under center as opposed to what 98
95
to 2,
or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like I think that we're going to see a lot more of that because it's going to be similar to what Stefanski, Shermer, DiFilippo, and then going back further, obviously Andy Reid like to do offensively. The thing is with Petzing, and what gets me excited about Petzing is he's legitimately a very bright, intelligent guy, right? So you've got a guy with a bachelor's in economics and minors in what philosophy and something else fancy out there. He's a guy that has worked with basically every position group already. He worked with, he was a wide receivers coach with the Vikings, quarterbacks coach, tight end coach, obviously with the Browns, and then the quarterback coach with the Browns last year. He's worked with a diverse group of quarterbacks. I mean, you look at it, you've got a guy like Jacoby Brissett, who's, much more statuesque. You've got a guy like Deshaun Watson, who's a little more mobile, scramble type of guy. And so I like that he's able to he's a guy that can learn, right, and adapt, and he uses what he's learning in order to put his players in a position to be successful. And that's something that, I think at times, and you and I were never going to be like, they need to fire Cliff. That was never our shtick. However, we did have some concerns and issues with Cliff, but we also had some concerns and issues with what they allowed Cliff to do, right? Like they never truly allowed Cliff to run his air raid offense. Like people looked at it and said, well, it's kind of air raid, but it was really not. It was kind of a hybrid of a lot of different things. And you could tell that Cliff was never super comfortable with it. Whereas like Petzing, he's going to bring in his offense. He's going to adapt it to fit what Kyler and Marquise Brown and James Conner and Trey McBride and those guys do well, while also being able to lean on a guy like Monty Ossenfort, which, goes back to one of our first conversations when they hired Ossenfort about, investing in the trenches and finding a way to get a guy like, or not a guy, but get offensive linemen that fit this West Coast style, that fit this style where they're able to, run. And I'm not going to say that they're going to end up being able to run the ball like, San Francisco. I think that would be foolhardy. But you look at Cleveland, even they had one of the best running games in the NFL, right? And Stefanski was part of, or sorry, not Stefanski, Petzing was part of that group, right? That helped build that offensive game plan to put the offense and the running game as a priority. And one of the things I think, and again, it's not official yet, but you look at Petzing, you look at Clayton Adams, who's supposed to be the offensive line coach, and you look at Drew Terrell. And one of the things that you get through all of those groups, and this goes along with Ossenfort, is guys that love to run the football, guys that love to teach how to block, how to scheme up a running game, and put an onus on that as being part of a successful offense. And I feel like that's very much something that you see from defensive coaches, right? That, their whole philosophy is like, score 7 points and we're going to win the game. Now, obviously that's not true, but like that's the mentality and the philosophy that they come with. And I think you're seeing that with Gannon, but he also understands that, like, hey, I've got a guy, and he's mentioned it a million times. I got a guy in Kyler Murray that can do some, unique and special things. So I need a guy like Petzing who's going to mentally challenge him the same, and look at him and try to scheme with him and try to grow with him in the same way.
The one thing that we look at with this group of, aside from Jeff Rogers, but both with Nick Rollis and Andrew Petzing, young and experienced. So we now have a head coach who's never been a head coach, an offensive coordinator who's never been a offensive coordinator, and then Rollis, a defensive coordinator who's never been a defensive coordinator. They're all young. Rollis is the youngest coordinator in the NFL at 29 years old. Petzing's 35. Are you concerned about the experience factor? I know experience isn't everything, and Gannon did promise major experience on the staff, and I think many of us were expecting a Mike Munchak, a Mike Zimmer. None of those have come to fruition yet. Adams has a lot of experience. Rogers is experienced in special teams, but in this case, obviously it's one of those things that you want to look at, and experience isn't everything. Gannon himself said it in the interview with Peter King, that he's 100% convicted. As I talked about in the interview with the other guys that I interviewed for those jobs as well, on the younger side too, probably one defensive guy was probably a little bit older. Said age isn't a prerequisite for firepower. I've always thought that. They had a young staff in Philadelphia, and they led to some success there, obviously. But is there any level of concern that you have? That I'm not worried so much about the age, except I'm more concerned about the experience. Like even with Cliff Kingsbury, he hadn't been in the NFL as a coach, but he had been a head coach for 6 years. The Cardinals now have a first-time head coach, first-time offense coordinator, first-time defensive coordinator. That means they're all learning. They're all doing things they've never done before. Any level of concern for the experience side?
I mean, it's always a concern, but I think, and you and I have talked about this, I think you look at two of the more successful teams over the last 3 seasons, and it's Philadelphia and Cincinnati. And those are teams that both of them hired first-time coordinators, right? Brian Callahan, a young buck, 34 when he got hired as the OC. By the way, his background was, Detroit Lions quarterback coach and Oakland Raiders quarterback coach. Like that was all of his background. He did the offensive quality control thing, but like the 4-12 Oakland Raiders, not like the ones that made the playoffs, in 2020, or 2021, whenever that was, the 4-12 first year back with John Gruden. And then he got hired as a offensive coordinator. Lou Anarumo, he was 52, but it was his first time being a DC ever. Well, I guess technically not, because he was a DC in, the early 90s at Merchant Marine Academy. I'm not being rude. I don't know what that is. And I guess he was an interim DC for a couple games with Miami, right? But, he was never a DC before. Yeah, he was 52, so I guess that's a little different than a 29-year-old, right? And so I think what matters comes in who you hire next. And you look at the Bengals staff, for instance. Zach Taylor, obviously first-time head coach. They brought in a guy in Mark Duffner, who is almost 70. He'll be 70 this year. He was a defense coordinator in college for a decade back in the late 70s and 80s. He was a head coach in college for a decade in the 80s and early 90s. And then he was an NFL coach for 2 decades, and then he became a senior defensive assistant, right? So who's the Mark Duffner of this staff? Who's the guy that comes in and kind of helps out in that way? Similar to like Philly, right? Philly this year, we talked about it. You got Shane Steichen, who's now the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts, and he's, he was not. I'm looking right now, just so he's 37. He got the job as an OC in at 35 with the Los Angeles Chargers, and then went to Philly, right? And he was fired, by the way, part of Anthony Lynn's staff that got let go. So it's not like he was successful. And then obviously we know Jonathan Gannon background. He's, the head coach now, so we know that. But like you look at it, they brought in Vic Fangio, right? Like defensive consultant. So they didn't have a guy on the staff. They didn't have that veteran, but they brought in a guy like, hey, Fangio, like, come be a defensive consultant for us. So I think that's kind of what I'm interested in. Are they going to bring in anybody? Are they going to bring in people that can help out in that situation? Or is it going to just end up being a lot of young guys, right?
Like, yeah, that's the part that we're going to be interested in seeing over the next little bit.
But you look, it's worked.
It has for sure, and I guess it matters how convicted they are in things, and honestly, how good a coach they are. Yeah, so coming up next on the Rise Up Zero podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the web. Let's come back and talk specifically comments that Gannon said about the offense. That's coming next on Rise Up Zero. We're back on the Rise Up Zero podcast, the best hour Cardinals talk on the web. Interesting comments by Jonathan Gannon on NBC Sports, the Football Morning in America column by Peter King, and it was what they talked about the offense, and it was almost, I guess, a little bit of a dig at the air raid or Cliff Kingsbury's offense, because he says this: they were in gun all the time. When you're in gun all the time, you don't make the defense defend certain play types. Now, when you get them under center, the defense has to defend a lot more play types. So there's really two offenses I see us using. He said that they're going to have two significant offenses with Kyler Murray's skill set, one under center, one being in the gun. And you mentioned that in the last segment. How much? Cliff Kingsbury was very clear when he came in. He said he doesn't believe philosophically that there are many things that you can do under center that you can't from the shotgun. And there's a lot of reasons why going with the shotgun is smart, because it allows the quarterback to see more of the field pre-snap. A lot of reasons to do a lot of that. But at the same time, tried and true under center, maybe it did limit some of the things. Is this surprising to hear that? Do you think that Gannon was? Do you think that was a little bit of a dig at the previous regime? And do you think that by adding that facet to the offense, that Kyler will actually be able to unlock a little more of what he can do?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the fair criticisms of Kingsbury, and it's something that you and I've talked about, is that we didn't feel like he challenged Kyler enough, right? Like he needed to push him more into being uncomfortable in order to have that, or to get the most out of him. And it just, never came to fruition. And so I think with what they want to do offensively, you're going to see more of that, which is going to allow this team to be a little more diverse, to be a little more multiple, to be a little more not, I guess what the word I'm looking for is, to not be so predictable in times. Yeah. And that was something that we saw too often, and I think that's what Gannon expects and wants to see. And so that's what the plan is. Now, obviously, it's going to take some time. And something we've talked about is obviously they're not going to be able to do that right away because, Kyler's rehabbing. So, it may not.
And maybe in some levels, they're going to do this because it will help other quarterbacks coming in who are used to doing multiple. That's one of the big questions that I've been asked, and I have one of the big questions I have moving forward is, had Cliff Kingsbury remained the coach, I think that's a lock. Colt McCoy starts the season as a starting quarterback. I'm not sure that's going to be the case this year. Right now, like it was a lock that Colt was going to be the guy until Kyler was ready. Colt is in the same basket as any quarterback and might be behind. It's like a guy like Jacoby Brissett, a guy like even like a Gardner Minshew, someone who they bring in who has been in this offense at all. Colt is no longer like in the driver's seat in terms of knowledge. Granted, he has been on teams that have run similar offenses, so it's.
But he also had little success. Like he's had the most success in his career with Cliff.
That's true.
What about Jacoby? I mean,
Jacoby is the interesting thing.
Make the most sense.
He does make the most sense. The interesting thing is, and if we get to like roster allocation, is unless Colt retires, which. Honestly, when he's coming on the second year of his largest contract in his career, it seems foolish to retire at this point. I mean, he has made enough money. Money allocation. You've got Kyler's contract. Jacoby Brissett's not going to come in on a Colt deal. It's going to cost more than that. And Colt's already guaranteed more than $2 million, which is more than you're generally going to pay a number 3 quarterback on your roster. And so Jacoby Brissett makes a ton of sense. But it becomes an interesting question of roster allocation.
Well, let me ask you this. What does it tell you about their belief in Kyler Murray's return or when it's going to happen? I think if they just roll with Colt, unless, like you said, he retires, if they go just Colt, it tells me they think he's going to be back within 4 games.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, if they have to go out and we're just throwing a name out there, like we're not saying anything, but like if they go out and sign a guy like Jacoby, who's been a stopgap for a number of teams already, doesn't that tell you they're like, okay, maybe it's not going to be till end of October, beginning of November?
Yes, I think that would make a lot of sense if they bring in another quarterback. You get the feel that, he's going to have to play a significant amount or a more significant amount. Or they don't, honestly, or this coaching staff doesn't believe in Colt.
Wow, there's that too. But that's the thing is, like, I'm kind of in agreement with you. I don't think that they go pay a guy like Jacoby if for 3 games. Like, I just don't. But I do think if they think it's going to be 8 games or, 7 games, or, we'll find out where they're at in the bye. When does that come out? May, March?
Usually in May is when when the schedule comes out.
Yeah. So, they, that may tell you something with the bye and everything, but I'm with you. I have a hard time allocating 3 monster, and it's not monster, but 3, you're going to be talking $50 million in contracts for quarterbacks if you go sign Jacoby. That's a lot for 3 or 4 games, right? Like
yes,
you said,
yes.
Unless Colt retires. So, yeah, and so I think that's partially it, right? Like the offense should be a little more normal, I guess.
Yes, that's the one thing. It'll look more like an NFL offense.
Right.
And the one thing I've always wondered, because Cliff did a really good job, and I think it was smart to make it easy for Kyler as a rookie to where, and I think I said it on the show last week. I think the fact that he basically gave Kyler the college offense that he ran at Oklahoma as a rookie made it very easy to transition to the pros and be successful. However, come year 3 and year 4, and you're still running the same offense without adding other complexities to it or asking him to do more within the offense other than make calls at the line of scrimmage, that probably wasn't maximizing everything that Kyler can be as a quarterback, because there are some things that, in other offenses that the quarterbacks do that make them even greater. And that hasn't been asked of Kyler yet, other than, hey, Kyler, go be a Superman.
Right. And I think you and I are in agreement. That's kind of what we're expecting the offense to change and look like now, as opposed to what it has been over the last, like you said, 3 years, because the rookie year, it made sense. But after that, like you said, it just never grew to what the expectation level would be of an NFL offense.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's wrap this up and talk a little bit about a number of other things that Gannon said in his introductory press conference and with Peter King. That's coming up next at Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Gannon revealed a whole lot of things between the press conference and the interview with Peter King. I want to talk a little bit about coaching philosophy. And Lascidas, as you'll hear in the interview later this week, he opened the door, and it's kind of what we expected, what we've known about Cliff Kingsbury. Cliff Kingsbury is not an in-your-face guy. He doesn't try to. He's not even super rah-rah. He's super upbeat, but he's not going to get in your face. He simply says, "We're adults. You're a professional. You get paid a crap ton, a lot of money to do this. Do your job. Here's your job. Do it." Gannon is not like that. He said in his introductory press conference that, and it feels a lot like Bruce Arians. Bruce Arians subscribed to the philosophy of Bear Bryant: coach him hard, hug him afterwards. And Sirianni, and not Sirianni, but Gannon talked about loving him up, and that means he's going to coach you really hard, and he's going to show him a lot of love afterward. And that's a philosophy that I absolutely love. I like what Cliff did as well, but it doesn't work for a lot. Like, unless you get a highly professional group of players, then and a lot of players from high school level up, they're used to and need that hard coaching, and that sort of thing is, I think, what we're going to see a little differently. This is going to be a little more Bruce Arians, but perhaps not. It's not going to be like Greg Williams, who is just, oh my gosh.
It's going to be a little more PG-13
right,
Arians as opposed to
right. and Arians did it for show partly. He did it to be a little over the top. It's going to be interesting to see, because he's very upbeat. He's going to push. He's going to push. He's going to push. But I think that he's still more positive, and he's not like Greg Millies. Have you ever seen clips of him coaching? It's not positive. It's just mean.
No.
Honestly, I think it's just mean. Now, some players will respond to that, and his defensive scheme has been successful in the NFL. I would not want to be coached by that man.
Right, and I think that's a common thing. And here's the thing. I mean, I don't think we've seen a coach here quite like Gannon. Like you said, Arians is probably the closest one, but there's very few guys that draw the excitement and respect and attention that Gannon does. It's just rare to see guys that kind of want to run through that brick wall for people, right? And that's what Gannon brings. And so the question just becomes, is that something that is sustainable in terms of creating a culture, or is it something that will wear? That's always been my question about the Arians philosophy, right? Like with with BA, obviously we know what happened the last 2 seasons. But even in Tampa, it seemed, and like I said, he's not quite as harsh as Bruce was, but that last year in Tampa where he was the head coach, it still wasn't great, right? Like all of a sudden, and so I just wonder if that's something that's sustainable for a long period of time, or because Gannon is so positive, if it overweighs the kind of, like you said, the yell and then hug thing, because he is such a positive dude in that way.
That's the thing that you want to see, because like Jim Harbaugh, his competitiveness, he would great, and his personality would just.
It's why he's a better college coach, because those guys are gone 3 to 4 years,
and they're younger, and that's part of it, is because they're younger, and so you push, and you push them through the program, and then they go to the pros, and that doesn't resonate for as long when you're at the pro level. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. Like, there are some players who clearly were not fans of Bruce Arians. DJ Humphries was not a fan of Bruce Arians' style. Dating back to his rookie year, he carried that grudge all the way to the Cliff Kingsbury era.
But DJ was at the introductory press conference, wasn't he?
He was. Yes, he was.
See, and that's the thing. I think part of it is maturity from DJ.
Well, yes, but I think what it is that Gannon, I don't think he's going to call out. BA called out players.
No, and that's what I was going to say. I think it's similar but different, and I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's similar in the sense that, like, yeah, he likes to be boisterous and yell, but I think it's a way more positive situation than what BA brought, and that's not taking anything away from BA. And let's be honest, we hope he's as good of a coach as BA was.
Yes, that's the best 5-year stretch that the Cardinals have had in their entire history. And
so if that works out, it is what it is. But one of the things we want to see a 41, 42-year-old guy that can make it to 48 in this organization, right? Like, can we get to 6 years? Like, can that happen?
So we thought it was going to happen with Cliff. We're like, hey, we're going to finally get someone past. Nope. Never mind.
Yeah.
He didn't even get to start his extension. He didn't even get to start his extension.
Right. And real quick, to go back to what you said, I think that works. Cliff's mentality works if you are running an extremely successful.
Yes, Tony Dungy was the same way. Andy Reid is the same way.
Right, but it works only when it's working. Does that make sense? Like,
right.
Once you need to rein in and start bringing in that accountability, the horse is out of the barn already. Like, there's no going back, and that's kind of what happens, I think, with a lot of it.
Honestly, interesting thing that he also said. Apparently, he took maybe less money than, like, the Eagles wanted to pay him more than he wanted to pay him head coaching money to stay as their coordinator, and made it suggesting that they would pay him more to stay in Philly than the Cardinals are paying him to be their head coach, but he ultimately chose the head coaching job. Maybe,
first off, I don't see any way that's plausible, but maybe.
Unless those were the final details that they were working out, because they noted that the deal was basically done Monday night, and that there were some details to hammer out Tuesday, and maybe that was a little extra something from the Cardinals, because Philly had upped the offer to keep him in Philly.
Right. And so that's the thing. I mean, and when you look at it, this organization, as much as they're going to toe the line and make sure that everybody knows that they didn't, pursue Gannon until it was legal, it was clear. I mean, like you said, as quickly as it got done one day, it was clear that this was the guy.
Right.
This
Now
was...
they apparently they did this so they didn't they purposely didn't distract the other team, so they never requested permission until they didn't interview anyone who was like in the playoffs.
Right.
And so they waited. And sure, that's one thing, but that doesn't mean that the feelers were out there. Which is interesting because according to Gannon, he didn't even know that he was interviewing until Roseman told him Sunday night after the Super Bowl. He's like, you're staying here. You're staying.
Yeah.
You're staying. Like, is that true or not? Like, he didn't know he was interviewing for the job until the night before and after the Super Bowl.
Right. It's hard to believe. But, I mean, it makes for a good story.
Yeah. Anything else of note? Is there anything else of note from what we have heard Gannon say either in his introductory press conference or in that interview with Peter King that is worth discussing before we have suddenly that becomes old news? And now we're going to hear, because I believe it is on Wednesday. By the time you hear this episode, Petzing and Rollis will have already addressed the media, and we'll have more to talk about clearly next week.
Well, I think the big thing was, and I've kind of said this from the beginning, is that this is the first time I can remember since Arians where there is organizational kind of unity from top to bottom. I mean, it's just not something that we saw the last two hiring cycles. I'm, hopeful that it plays out in the positive way and wins, but we can't really complain about this at this point, because this is what we all asked for, right? This is a Monty Ossenfort hire. Jonathan Gannon's bringing in the guys he wants. I think this is, it speaks volumes to what they're trying to do, and that should be exciting.
Absolutely. It feels like the Cardinals are moving away from doing things they're like the Cardinal way they've already done, the way, and are starting to look more like other successful franchises. That wraps up this edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We will have the Lecitus Smith interview episode drop later in the week, and Seth and I will be back again next week to talk. Who knows? It'll probably be coordinator stuff, and we can start talking about the roster. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. This is the Rise Up C-Red podcast. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up Sea Red.
Rise up! Rise!